Everett Coleman had never trusted anyone who worked too hard to be good. That might have sounded harsh if he'd ever said it out loud. He never did. He kept it where he kept most things, filed behind his sternum, next to the memory of a woman named Miriam who had worked in his family's home for 11 years and left one winter morning with his mother's jewelry and a note that said nothing at all. He was 9 years old when that happened. His father had found him sitting on the kitchen floor holding Miriam's apron, which she'd left behind. "That's the one thing thieves always forget," his father said. "They take what glitters. They leave the ordinary." Everett never forgot that. Now at 41 he ran Coleman Medical Group, 12 private clinics across the eastern seaboard, a research wing in Boston, and a headquarters building in downtown Hartford that people described as cold but efficient, which he privately considered a compliment. He was not a difficult man to work for, his staff would say. He was fair, he was precise, and he paid well. He simply did not mistake proximity for trust. So when the new caregiver arrived at his father's residential suite inside the Hartford facility, Everett watched her the way he watched everything, quietly, from a distance, and with more suspicion than his face ever revealed. Her name was June Whitaker. She had come through an agency, background check clean, references solid. She was in her early 30s, slight, with dark eyes that moved carefully around a room before she entered it fully. She wore plain scrubs, no jewelry, hair tied back low. She didn't smile too much, which was either a good sign or a bad one. He hadn't decided. His father, Thomas Coleman, was 74 and recovering from a hip replacement. He was also one of the most difficult patients the facility had ever seen. He'd sent 3 previous caregivers away inside of 2 weeks, one for speaking too loudly, one for rearranging his books without permission, and one simply because, as Thomas put it. She looked at me like I was already gone. Thomas Coleman was not a man who accepted pity. June Whitaker lasted past the first week. Then the second. Thomas didn't mention sending her away. That alone made Everett pay attention. He started noticing things. Small things. The way she always knocked before entering, even when the door was open. The way she never spoke over Thomas but waited, actually waited, for him to finish a sentence. One afternoon, Everett passed the room and heard his father laughing. Not the polite, obligatory laugh Thomas performed for visitors. The real one, low and surprised, the one Everett hadn't heard since his mother was alive. He stood in the hallway for a moment, hand on the doorframe, and said nothing. That night back in his office, Everett sat with the security footage pulled up on his secondary monitor. Not because he suspected anything criminal, more because he couldn't explain her, and unexplained things made him uneasy. He watched her move through the suite, methodical, unhurried. She refilled Thomas's water without being asked. She adjusted the blinds when the afternoon light shifted. She straightened the photograph on the nightstand, a picture of Everett's mother, and paused on it for a moment, just a breath before moving on. She doesn't take overtime. His assistant Ray had mentioned earlier, offered it twice. She said she didn't want to be paid for hours she hadn't earned. Everett had stared at the wall for a long time after hearing that. That's the part that unsettled him. Anyone could do the job correctly when they knew they were being evaluated. But June Whitaker didn't seem to be performing anything. She seemed to simply be what she was, and Everett didn't know what to do with that. His father had taught him that the most dangerous people were the consistent ones. Not because consistency was bad, but because it made you stop watching. He hadn't stopped watching, but he'd started watching for different reasons. He arranged it on a Thursday. It was a quarterly review day, which meant the senior administrative staff were occupied with back-to-back meetings. The residential wing would be quieter than usual. Everett told Ray he'd be working from his father's suite for the afternoon. Not unusual, since he occasionally did paperwork there. What was unusual was what he left on the small writing desk near the window. His personal checkbook, a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be sensitive patient intake forms, and a white envelope with his name printed on the outside, thick with what looked like cash, actually an advance from petty accounts, staged deliberately. He settled into the armchair near the bookshelf, jacket folded over the arm, and closed his eyes. He was not asleep. He had never been more awake in his life. His father was down the hall at physical therapy. The suite was empty except for Everett, and in 12 minutes, June Whitaker, who had a scheduled afternoon check-in to restock supplies and change the linens. He heard her before he saw her, the faint sound of the linen cart in the hallway. A pause outside the door. She always paused before entering. Then the soft knock. When no one answered, she pushed the door open slowly and looked inside. Her gaze moved across the room in the careful, practiced way he'd noticed before. She saw him in the armchair. She didn't startle. She simply adjusted her movement, quieter now, the way people move around someone sleeping. She went to the supply cabinet first. He heard the soft shuffle of stacking linens, the click of a cabinet door. Then the faint sound of her moving toward the bed to strip and replace the covers. He kept his breathing even. His face relaxed. She worked her way around the room without touching his desk. He registered that. She dusted the windowsill, replaced the water in the small pitcher by the nightstand, collected the used towels from the bathroom. At one point she passed within 2 feet of the desk, close enough to see the envelope clearly, and kept moving without a pause. Everett's jaw was tight beneath his still face. Then came the moment he hadn't scripted. She had finished the bed, she was gathering her cart, and then she stopped. He heard her footsteps cross back toward the desk, slow and deliberate. His pulse kicked up against his will. She didn't touch the envelope. Instead, she picked up the portfolio, which had slipped partially off the desk and was hanging over the edge, papers nearly fanning loose, and repositioned it squarely on the surface. Then she took a small yellow sticky note from her cart, wrote something, and pressed it to the top of the portfolio. Her footsteps moved toward the door. Everett opened his eyes after she left. He sat still for a moment, then stood and crossed to the desk. The note said, "The edge of the desk seems uneven. Portfolio was almost on the floor. May want to check the leveling." JW, he read it twice. She'd noticed the desk was off balance. She'd noticed papers were about to fall. And instead of ignoring it, or mentioning it to someone else later, she'd left a note to the room's occupant. Matter of fact. No signature beyond initials. No bid for credit. Everett set the note down and looked out the window at the parking lot 3 stories below. He stayed in that room for a long time after that, and not because of the desk. He told himself he was being careful. He ran the scenario again in his mind, looking for angles. Maybe she'd noticed the camera above the bookshelf. Maybe this was calibrated behavior, performed for an audience. He'd seen people game evaluations before. The staff member who suddenly started working weekends when reviews were due, the contractor who CC'd him on emails he'd never asked for. But the camera above the bookshelf had been decommissioned 8 months ago after a privacy audit. There was no recording device in the suite. He had made sure of that before setting the test. She hadn't been performing for anyone. He reviewed the footage from the hallway camera that evening, the only active one that captured the suite door. It showed her exiting at 3:22 p.m., linen cart in tow, moving at the same unhurried pace she always moved. No hesitation, no glancing back. Just June Whitaker finishing a shift and heading to the next room. Everett turned off his monitor and sat in the dark for longer than he usually sat anywhere. The incident happened 9 days later. There was a family named Prescott. Old Hartford money, longtime Coleman medical clients. The patriarch, Gerald Prescott, had been a patient of the residential wing for 2 months. His daughter, Vivian Prescott, was the kind of woman who treated other people's competence as a personal affront to her social standing. Vivian had been in the facility twice that week and had taken a visible dislike to June. Everett had heard this secondhand from the charge nurse. She'd made comments about the quality of afternoon care, questioned whether June had the appropriate credentials, asked the front desk to confirm her licensing. The front desk had confirmed it. Vivian had not seemed satisfied. The confrontation happened in the 3rd floor common area. Everett heard it before he rounded the corner. "I saw you in my father's room this morning." Vivian's voice carried the kind of precision that only comes from a lifetime of never being told to lower it. He mentioned his watch was missing. June's voice was quieter, impossible to hear from the hallway. "I'm not suggesting anything." Vivian's tone suggested exactly something. "I'm simply noting that the watch was there before your shift and gone after it. That's a fact." Everett turned the corner. June was standing near the window, hands folded in front of her, face very still. Not defensive, not frightened. The particular stillness of someone who had learned that arguing made things worse. Margaret, the wing supervisor, stood to the side, caught between professional obligation and clear discomfort. Vivian saw Everett and pivoted immediately. "Mr. Coleman, I was just raising a concern about, I heard." He looked at June. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Something moved through her expression, a quick calculation like she was deciding how much truth the room could hold. "No, sir," she said. "Not right now." "That's an odd answer," Vivian said. "Margaret," Everett said, "can you give us a moment?" Margaret left quickly, clearly relieved. Vivian remained, which he had expected. Mrs. Prescott, he said, I appreciate you raising this directly. I'll look into Mr. Prescott's room personally. If you'd like to wait in the family lounge, I'll have someone come find you. It was a polite dismissal, and Vivian Prescott was smart enough to recognize it, and too aware of her family's relationship with the facility to refuse it. She left with the particular stiffness of someone choosing a battle for later. Then it was just Everett and June in the quiet of the common room. You want to tell me now? He said. She looked out the window for a moment, then she said, It won't change anything. Tell me anyway. She turned to face him. Her voice was steady, but she chose each word carefully, the way people do when they've rehearsed sentences and then realize the rehearsal isn't right for the actual room. I worked at a rehabilitation center in Providence 2 years ago. One of my patients, Mr. Alderman, had a family who visited maybe twice in 4 months. He was declining, and he knew it. He used to talk to me while I changed his dressings, because he didn't have much else to talk to. One day he told me he wanted to leave something for his grandchildren. He had me help him write letters. I drafted them, and he signed them. After he passed, his son found the letters in the drawer and decided I'd influenced the drafting to redirect an inheritance. He filed a complaint. The center's attorney advised them that the simplest resolution was to let me go. She paused. I was asked if I wanted to contest it. I said yes. My supervisor said the process could take 8 to 10 months, and in the meantime I wouldn't be able to work in any affiliated facility. I had rent. I had my sister's tuition. I let it go. She looked at him directly. The watch will turn up. Mr. Prescott probably moved it. He does that with his glasses. Margaret knows. She stopped. But that's not the part that matters, is it? You want to know why I didn't say anything when she accused me? Everett said nothing. Because I've learned, she said, that when someone with money accuses someone without it, the room is already halfway decided before anyone speaks. If I argue, I look guilty. If I stay quiet, I look guilty. The only difference is whether I keep my dignity while it happens. The common room was very still. Everett looked at her for a long moment, not the way he looked at staff when he was evaluating performance, but the way he looked at buildings when he was trying to understand the structure underneath. The watch, he said quietly, is almost certainly in the top drawer of Gerald Prescott's nightstand, which is where Margaret found his glasses this week and the week before that. I'll have her check in the next 10 minutes. He paused. And for what it's worth, you're not being let go. June's expression didn't break into relief the way he'd half expected. She just nodded, once, and looked back out the window, like she'd held herself together so long that being told she was safe didn't immediately translate into feeling it. That was the part that stayed with him. He was almost to the elevator when he heard her speak behind him quietly, almost to herself. I stayed because your father asked me to, she said. He turned. She was still looking out the window. The second week, when he was having a bad pain day, he asked me not to request a reassignment. He said, a small pause, he said the room felt less like a hospital when I was in it. She looked down at her hands. I don't take that lightly. Everett stood in the hallway for a moment after that, then turned and walked to the elevator. The watch was in Gerald Prescott's top drawer. Everett did not tell Vivian Prescott this in a way that felt triumphant. He told her quietly and directly, and then he moved on. Because making someone feel foolish was less interesting to him than understanding why they'd done the thing they'd done. Vivian was scared. Her father was dying. Scared people with money often reached for control in the only direction available. He didn't excuse it, but he filed it in the right folder. What he couldn't file as easily was June Whitaker. He found himself doing things he didn't usually do. He started arriving at the facility slightly earlier on the days she was scheduled. Not to check on her, she didn't need checking on, but because the wing had a different quality when she was there. His father was easier in the mornings. He ate more. He asked for books, instead of just sitting in front of the muted television. One afternoon, Everett passed the suite and saw her sitting in the chair beside his father's bed, not doing anything medical, just reading aloud from a novel. His father's eyes were closed, but his face was different, the particular rest of someone who isn't asleep but has stopped being tense. Everett kept walking, but slowly. He started leaving small things in the staff break room on her shift days without making it traceable. A decent coffee from the cart downstairs, the kind that didn't come from the machine. He wasn't sure why. He knew he was doing it. Then came the October board meeting. Coleman Medical Group was finalizing a partnership with a regional nursing college to fund a clinical residency program. Nurses would rotate through the residential wing as part of a paid fellowship. It was Everett's initiative. He'd been building it for 2 years. The board approved the final terms that Thursday. After the meeting, back in his office, he sat with the program materials spread across his desk and thought about June Whitaker's story about the rehabilitation center in Providence. About the complaint that wasn't contested because she couldn't afford the 8 months of waiting. He picked up the phone and called the program director. He didn't ask for specifics about how the admission process worked or how credentials were reviewed. He asked about something else, whether the program had a provision for applicants who'd had employment records disputed through no fault of their own, and whether there was a way to review those cases on their individual merits rather than filtering them at the initial screening. The director said yes, there was. It just wasn't well publicized. Everett said he wanted it publicized. He did not call June. He did not mention the conversation to anyone at the facility. He did not put his name on the materials when they were updated and recirculated. He was not looking for credit. He was looking at the logical shape of the problem and moving a piece that needed moving. 3 days later, a program brochure appeared in the break room of the residential wing, placed there by a staff coordinator who had no idea Everett had been involved. June picked it up during her shift, read it, and set it on the counter. She stood there for a long time with her hand resting on it. Everett was not in the building when this happened. He didn't see it. He only heard about it. Weeks later, from his father. "That young woman," Thomas said one morning, not looking up from his book. "She applied to the nursing program." Everett looked up from the quarterly reports he was reviewing in the corner chair. "Did she? She told me this morning." Thomas turned a page. "She seemed surprised she was eligible. Said she didn't think she'd qualify." He paused. "She cried a little, thought I didn't notice." A dry, quiet sound. "I noticed." Everett looked back at his papers. "You wouldn't know anything about that," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question quite. The eligibility provision was always there," Everett said. "She just needed to know it existed." Thomas turned another page. He didn't say anything else. But the corner of his mouth moved in a way that Everett recognized. 2 months later, June Whitaker received a letter of acceptance to the Coleman Medical Group nursing residency. She submitted it to the clinical director, who submitted it to HR, who submitted it to Everett's desk as routine documentation. He signed the acknowledgement form and placed it in the outgoing stack. He sat with his coffee for a long moment after that. He didn't know exactly when the shift had happened inside him. Not a single moment, more like a pressure that built slowly, the way weather builds, until one day you look at the sky and realize you'd stopped watching for storms. The last time he saw June before her residency started was a Tuesday morning. His father had been discharged to home care the week prior. The recovery had gone better than projected, which Thomas attributed to stubbornness and June attributed to the physical therapy team, which Everett found clarifying about both of them. She was clearing out the remaining personal items from the suite, a few of his father's books that hadn't made it into the discharge boxes. Everett came to help carry them down to the car. They worked without much conversation, which was typical for them. June organized. Everett carried. The suite grew quieter as it emptied. At the door, she stopped and looked back at the room for a moment. "He's going to be all right," she said. Not to Everett, not to the room. Just a quiet statement, the kind people make when they need to hear it aloud. "He is," Everett said. She picked up the last box. He held the door. "I know it was you," she said, not looking at him. "The eligibility change." He didn't answer immediately. "The provision was already in the framework," he said. "I know. That's not what I said." She looked at him then, straight on, the way she had in the common room after Vivian Prescott left. "I said I know it was you." The hallway was empty. Somewhere below them, a cartwheel squeaked against linoleum, and someone's pager sounded and went quiet. "You're going to be a good nurse," he said. She almost smiled. "Not quite. The kind that lives just behind the eyes before it decides whether to come forward." "You could come find out," she said. "In about 9 months." She walked to the elevator, box in her arms, and pressed the button without looking back. Everett stood at the door of the empty suite for a moment, his father's last stack of books under one arm, and looked down the hallway at the closed elevator doors. For the first time in longer than he could account for, the future felt like something other than a problem to be managed. The residency ran 9 months. Everett saw June twice during that period. Once in the lobby when she was coming off a rotation and he was heading into an operations meeting, once in the third-floor break room when they both reached for the coffee at the same time, and she laughed, brief and unguarded, before she caught herself. He thought about that laugh more than was professionally warranted. The day her residency concluded, there was a small ceremony in the conference room. Certificates, department head remarks, a tray of decent pastries that someone had thought to order. Everett attended because he attended all program milestones. That was what he told himself going in. Afterward, in the hallway, June found him before he reached the elevator. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Properly. The program thanks its residents," he said. "You earned the placement, I know." She held his gaze. "That's not what I'm thanking you for." She reached into the pocket of her white coat and placed something in his hand. It's a small card, the kind that came with a florist's bouquet, plain white with a single line in her handwriting. "You saw me before I knew I was worth seeing. That's not a small thing." He looked at it for a long time. "I have a conference in Boston next Friday," he said. "I'd like to take you to dinner when I'm back." June looked at him the way she sometimes looked at his father's room, like she was taking a careful inventory before allowing herself to settle. "Saturday," she said. "I have a shift Friday, Saturday," he said. She nodded, turned and walked back toward the residency group still gathered in the conference room. Everett stood in the hallway with the small card in his hand, the building quiet around him in the way it got on late afternoons, when the visitor rush was done and the staff had found their rhythm, and there was just the sound of the facility doing what facilities do. Taking care, slowly, of the living. He had not trusted easily in 30 years. He did not expect to suddenly start. But he folded the card carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to the chest, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the weight there felt like something he wanted to keep.